Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. My name is Amanullah Sand, and I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. I welcome you all at Teacher Development Webinars, and now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Simon Borg for this webinar. Simon Borg has been involved in language education over 30 years. He has worked in a range of international contexts and is recognized internationally for his work on teacher professional development. After 15 years at the University of Leeds, where he was professor of TESOL, Simon now works full-time as an English educational consultant with a particular focus on designing, facilitating, and evaluating a teacher professional development program. He also holds a visiting professor position at Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Full details of his work, including the Borg, are available at website simonborg.co.uk. Welcome, Simon. It's a pleasure to have you at Teacher Development Webinars.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone, wherever you are. Let me just share my screen now. Okay, Amanola, could you just confirm, please? That's visible. Okay, great. So we'll begin. So
yeah,
thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about a topic that I think is quite important in the field of professional development, one that we don't hear much about, but one that I think it's worth spending a bit of time thinking about today, and that's the topic of teacher self-awareness. So I'll explain what teacher self-awareness is. I'll talk a bit about why it's important for all of us as professionals, and discuss some of the things we can do to become more self-aware as teachers. So, we all understand the importance of professional development. Typically, when we think about the purpose of professional development, in simple terms, it's about knowledge growth. So we take part in professional development in order to improve our knowledge of various aspects of our work. It might be theoretical knowledge, it might be more practical knowledge, but in simple terms, that's the goal of professional development: increase knowledge and become a better professional. So what do we do to achieve knowledge growth? We participate in various types of professional development programs, and we attend training courses, we attend seminars, webinars, and typically these activities will focus on subject matter, so helping us learn more about our subject, whether it's English, maths, or science. That's something that we can improve our knowledge of. Professional development focuses on instruction, helping us with the teaching side, the pedagogical side of our work. So we learn teaching techniques, for example. Professional development helps us develop a better knowledge of our learners, a better knowledge of curriculum, of assessment, of materials. These are common themes that are addressed in professional development. But one of the points I want to make today is that one topic that rarely gets addressed is knowledge of self. And this is something to stress. It's a dimension of professional development which is important, but which is not really addressed very often in professional development contexts, because we spend our time focusing on the other areas that I've already mentioned. So I'd just like to emphasize today that it is important, in addition, of course, to learning about the subject, in addition to learning about how to teach, it's important that we find some space when we engage in professional development to think a bit more about how we can become more aware of ourselves as professionals. Now, there are good reasons why it's difficult to find the time, not just for professional development generally, but to think about ourselves, to become more aware of ourselves. And that's because you know as well as I do that teaching is a very busy job. It involves multitasking, it involves juggling, it involves running from one lesson to the next, it involves planning, it involves marking, it involves administration, it involves meeting parents very often. And of course, on top of all of that, or alongside all of that, we've got life generally. So I fully understand the challenges that we face as professionals, that you face as professionals, to find time, not just for professional development, but to squeeze in some space for some quiet reflection, perhaps on ourselves as professionals. But again, the point I want to make today, that it's important that when we have space for professional development, it is important that sometimes we can make good use of that time by allocating it to reflection on self. So when we talk about becoming self-aware as professionals, it's quite a simple idea. It means developing a realistic understanding of what we do, of why we do it, and of the results or the consequences of what we do. So there are three questions we need to think about, which we'll go through today. One is, how do we become aware? How do we develop a realistic understanding of what we do, first of all? That's the starting point. The second one is an understanding of why we do what we do. And the third one is an understanding of the consequences of what we do. So those are the three elements which together allow us to become more self-aware as professionals. So as we said, behavior, that's where we'll start. I'll talk about behavior first. Rationale is the why, the reasons for what we do, and an understanding of consequences. Consequences for learning typically, but there may be other consequences of our behavior as professionals. So let's start with behavior first of all, because that needs to be the starting point. So let's imagine if I came into your classroom and observed you teaching for a while, one lesson, two lessons, it doesn't really matter. You know, what would I notice? So we're focusing on the visible dimension of teaching here. That consists of what we do and what we say. So what would I notice about your typical behaviors if I came into your classroom? Would I notice anything, for example, about the way you start and end lessons? Are there particular strategies, processes that you regularly follow there? What would I notice about the kinds of questions you ask? Do you ask open questions, where pupils are free to give a variety of answers? Do you ask closed questions where there's maybe one answer or shorter answers? Do you ask, display questions where you already know the answer as a teacher and want to test students' knowledge? Or do you ask, referential questions where there is no one correct answer? So if I came to observe you, what would I notice about your questioning behavior, for example? What would I notice about the kinds of activities you ask students to do and the way you organize pupils? Do you work at whole class level? Do you work in pairs? Do they work in groups? Do you have a particular preference in the way you do things? Another example is, what would I notice about your personality as a teacher, just from observing you? Do you look friendly? Do you look serious? Do you look stern? Do you smile? Do you laugh? Do you joke? What would I notice just by observing you in the classroom? These are just some examples of what we mean by behavior. And they may seem like obvious things, but the reality is that as professionals, very often we don't have a full understanding of these aspects of our own work. And if we look at this more fully, what does teacher behavior consist of? And if we go around, we're starting from the left, teacher behavior consists of teaching techniques, consists of how we assess, how we plan, the kinds of reflection we engage in, the kinds of professional development we do, our relationships with learners, and also our behavior with colleagues. The way we interact and work with colleagues is also an important part of teacher behavior. So these are all legitimate topics for us to focus on when we try to start to become more aware of what we do. Any of these can be a legitimate focus. Now, it's important that we look systematically at behavior, of course, because we know that the way we see ourselves and the way we appear to others may not always be the same. And you will have seen images like this before of the kitten looking in the mirror, and in their reflection, they see a lion. And that's sometimes what can happen to us as teachers, not necessarily that we think of ourselves as lions, but the point is here is the way we see ourselves, what we think we do, and the way we come across to others, or what others see, or what we actually do, may not actually be the same. And that's why it's very important for us from a professional development point of view to systematically investigate our own behaviors. And this is something that's been discussed in the literature on psychology and educational psychology quite a lot. And there's a quote here which says that our sense of self may not necessarily be an accurate reflection of our actual abilities or performance. So this is a nice quote for us to take away as teachers, that our sense of self, what we think we do, what we think we're able to do, may not necessarily be an accurate reflection of our abilities or performance. And the only way to understand how far that is true for us is to engage in professional development that allows us to become more self-aware as teachers. So we're talking about collecting evidence of what we do. So what steps can we take as teachers to collect evidence of what we do? Well, there are a number of strategies. There's self-observation. Self-observation is when we systematically observe ourselves in the classroom. And this requires a certain amount of skill because, of course, we have to go on teaching, but at the same time, we're stepping back from our teaching and looking more objectively at what's happening. We may be making notes about what's happening during the lesson. We may decide to audio record ourselves or video record ourselves and look at that later. But what we're thinking about is how can we collect evidence of what we actually do in the classroom, of our actual behaviors, for us to take away and think about. We can also do peer observation. Many of you will be familiar with peer observation. It's when we bring in a colleague into our classroom and they assist us in documenting what actually happened. So you might bring a colleague in and you might say to my colleague, look, what I'd like you to do is pay attention to my board work. Pay attention to the way I use the board, for example. Or what I'd like you to do is pay attention to the questions I ask. And every time I ask a question, please write down what that question is. And then, you know, after the lesson, you can discuss that with your peer. And again, it's another way of becoming aware of what we do. We can get feedback from students to better understand what we do. We can also look at various types of documents like lesson plans, for example. They're another way of getting insight into what we do. So an important question for us to take away from this session is, what steps can we take, practical steps, to become more aware of what we do, particularly in the classroom as professionals? These are some ideas, but there are others that you may be able to use. So this is what we talked about earlier. In the process of becoming self-aware requires us to become aware of behavior, first of all. But then we also need to start thinking, once we are aware of our behaviors, of why we do what we do. What are the reasons for those behaviors? What are the factors that are shaping those behaviors? So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, I'll give you a practical example of something I come across quite a lot in my work. This is from the field of language teaching, but we could use similar examples from other subjects. This is a gap filling activity. This will be very familiar to many of you. And in my work with teachers, I find this is a kind of exercise in the classroom that's used very often and very widely. And so when I'm working with teachers to help them, become more aware of what they do, I might notice that this is an exercise they use quite a lot. And if we have the opportunity to sit down and have a chat about their work, I might say to them, look, I noticed that you use gap filling exercises quite often, and I'm interested in why you do that. And I would give the teacher the opportunity to maybe think about that and explain. Now, teachers give me lots of reasons for using these activities. Some teachers say they're a good way to control the class. They're a good way to keep students quiet. So it's almost like a disciplinary measure or a classroom management strategy. Other teachers say, well, that they're just good because they provide repeated practice of particular language structures. Other teachers say, I use them because they're in the book. Other teachers say, I use them because they're in the test or they're going to be in the test. And some teachers struggle to give me a reason. They don't really know why they use them. They just sort of say, well, everyone uses them. I've always used them. And that's all I can say. So even taking a simple activity like this, or any kind of activity that you use regularly, and asking yourself the question, why do I use this activity? And thinking about the kinds of responses you provide, that can be a useful way of starting to be more aware of not just what you do, but why you do it. And it's important that as professionals, of course, we're able to articulate convincing reasons, clear reasons for the pedagogical decisions and behaviors that characterize our work. Now, the metaphor of the iceberg, again, is one you may have come across before in discussions of professional development. It's a useful metaphor for us to use when we're trying to think about what teachers do and why they do it. And I very often ask teachers, what do icebergs and teachers have in common? And if we were doing this face to face and we're able to interact a bit more, I'd give you some time to discuss this in your groups. But I'll just tell you some of the answers that teachers typically give me. They say to me, well, icebergs are cool, and so are teachers. Teachers are cool. So that's one comparison. Or some teachers say to me, icebergs are tough, and so are teachers. And others say icebergs are cold, and so are teachers. And so these are all quite creative and in some ways justified explanations. But the comparison I'd like to focus your attention on is this one, is that icebergs, just like teaching, have a visible dimension and an invisible dimension. And as you will have heard, icebergs have a much larger part of their body beneath the water rather than above the water, as you can see in this picture. And if we apply this to teaching, the part of the iceberg above the surface is the behavior in teaching. It's what we can directly observe. It's what teachers do. It's what learners do. It's what teachers say. But beneath that behavior, there's another large invisible dimension of teaching, which we can't directly see, but which is having an influence on what we do. So if we look there beneath the surface, we've got things like teachers' beliefs, we've got teachers' knowledge, teachers' attitudes, teachers' feelings, and there are other things like emotions, values. These are all important but unobservable aspects of teaching that have an impact on what we do. So when we're working on self-awareness, when we're trying to understand why we do what we it's important to think about these aspects of our work. And I'll just take the example of beliefs to illustrate this. So, in simple terms, a belief is everything that we accept as being true or that we want to be true. I mean, there are longer and more complicated definitions, but in essence, that's what a belief is. And as teachers, as professionals, we have beliefs about all aspects of teaching and learning. We have beliefs about teachers and the role of teachers. We have beliefs about learners. We have beliefs about learning. We have beliefs about the subject matter, the curriculum, assessment. We have beliefs about our school systems, about colleagues. We have beliefs about all aspects of our work as professionals. And these shape, to some extent, what we do. And becoming self-aware as a teacher must involve becoming aware of these beliefs. Let's have a look at some statements about the relationship between beliefs and what we do, just to think a bit more. So these are 3 statements. I'm not saying they're true or false at this stage. I'm just asking you to think a little bit about whether they are true or not, in your opinion. And I'll talk about each of them in turn now. So the first statement is we are often unaware of our beliefs. As professionals, we are often unaware of our beliefs. Now, we may not like the sound of that, the idea that we're unaware of our beliefs, but the reality is that many professionals are in fact unaware of the beliefs which may be shaping what they do. So we have these beliefs which are exerting an invisible influence on what we do, and we may not really be fully aware of that. And one reason why as professionals we are often unaware of our beliefs is that we've never been given the opportunity to talk about them. Many professionals go through their careers without opportunities to talk about their beliefs about teaching, learning. So an important part of professional development is creating spaces in which teachers can not only think about the more practical side of teaching, but also to delve a bit more deeply into what they do and to talk about why they do what they do and what they believe. It's an important part of professional development that we need to create space for. As I say, many teachers go through their careers without having some opportunities, and therefore they're not particularly aware of our beliefs. And that's why when I ask some teachers, why do you use gap filling exercises, for example, they struggle to articulate reasons because they need some time to work through that process. So I think that first statement, I would argue that it is true. We are very often, or professionals are very often, unaware of the beliefs that underpin their work. The second statement is that our beliefs determine how we teach. So this question asks us to think about the relationship between the beliefs we have about teaching and learning and what we actually do in the classroom. What is that relationship? This is one simple way of explaining the relationship. And as you can see, it's a two-way relationship between beliefs and behavior. Okay, so beliefs do influence what we do, but it's not a one-way relationship. Behavior, in other words, our experience in the classroom, our experience as professionals, also shapes our beliefs. So for example, if I regularly do something in the classroom, I'm just going to give you a silly example. If I regularly make learners stand on one leg in the classroom, and that seems to result in better learning, then I'm going to develop a belief which says that standing on one leg improves learning. This is a silly example, of course, but I'm just trying to illustrate how behavior can also influence beliefs. It's not a one-way relationship. And that's important to keep in mind. So it's wrong to say that beliefs determine entirely what we do, because it's a two-way relationship. And it's also important for us to acknowledge that very often there is a distinction between what we say and what we do. And we have terms for these. We have, as you can see on this slide, espoused beliefs are the beliefs we say we hold. So if I ask you, do you believe that pair work is a good thing? You say, yes, definitely, it's good for learning. That's an espoused belief. It's a belief you are expressing in words. But we also have enacted beliefs. These are the beliefs that are implicit in what we do. And very often there is a distinction between the two, that very often the two do not match up. In other words, it is not uncommon for a teacher to say, I believe that pair work is valuable, but at the same time, not to use pair work in their classroom. And once you start exploring your beliefs and your practices, as you become more self-aware as a teacher, you may in fact become aware of situations where what you state as a belief and what you do as a practice are not the same. And that's a positive discovery for us as professionals. If we reach that level of self-awareness, we are definitely heading in the right direction, because then we can think more deeply about why that is the case. So why may it be, or why might it be, that what we believe and what we do sometimes are not the same? And here we need to think about the role of context, of course, because we all work in a context. We are all part of a system. And the system, the context we work in, can exert a powerful influence on what we do. So the context is very often a factor which explains why, when we start exploring our practices, why what we do and what we say we believe may not be the same. So I've worked with many teachers who say to me, we believe that group work is really important for learning, but when you observe their lessons, there's no group work. And when you talk with them about this afterwards and help them reflect on it, reasons emerge which are related to the context. For example, the physical layout of the classroom may not facilitate group work. They may have desks which are screwed down to the floor and can't be moved. There may be large numbers of pupils. There may be a policy in the school which requires teachers to keep children quiet and seated at all times. So these are powerful contextual factors which can mediate, which can influence the relationship between what we believe and what we do. And part of becoming self-aware as a teacher is starting to understand how these different influences interact in shaping what we do. This is a characteristic of the self-aware teacher. They're aware of what they do. They understand the factors that are influencing their behavior. And once we start to have that kind of understanding, we're in a position to make changes to our work in a positive way. The third statement I had earlier was that sometimes our beliefs may be incorrect. And the process of becoming self-aware as a teacher also requires us not just to become aware of the beliefs we hold, but also possibly to challenge them. In other words, to ask ourselves, okay, this is the belief I hold, but is this belief actually justified? Let's take an example. Here's a statement. Here's a belief about learning. Learning is more effective if pupils are taught according to their learning style. Learning is more effective if pupils are taught according to their learning style. So there is a school of thought in education which says something along the lines of pupils have different learning styles. Some learn more in a more auditory fashion by listening, others by seeing, others by touching, others by hearing, etc. And there is an argument in the literature that teachers need to understand individual learning styles and then to provide learning opportunities accordingly. Okay, so this is the idea behind learning styles. And this is a belief that is widely held. I've worked with many teachers who subscribe to this view. And so an important question for us, if we discover that this is a belief we hold, then is to say, okay, this is the belief I have, but what's the basis for this? Is this a justified belief? And then we need to go and look at other sources to see where the evidence is. And we might find something like this. Now, this is a conclusion based on a detailed review of evidence. And it says studies where teaching activities are targeted towards particular learners based on an identified learning style have not convincingly shown any major benefit. So as a teacher who's trying to become more self-aware, you come across this kind of conclusion, and this is from from an authoritative source. And that should make us think again about this belief that we need to tailor learning to particular learning styles. This says that when we look at the evidence, there isn't conclusive evidence or strong evidence that teaching towards learning styles has major benefits for learning. There's also the practical challenge here as well. If you've got 30, 40, 50, 60, 100, 200 learners in a class, is it even feasibly possible for you to identify their individual learning styles and to cater for them? That's more of a practical issue. But theoretically, from a research point of view, there isn't strong evidence for this belief. So this is an example of becoming aware of belief, articulating a belief that you hold about some aspect of learning, and then going away and looking for evidence. And you can find the evidence in the literature. You can also go away and ask colleagues what they think and see if they hold similar views as you. That's another way of challenging, in a sense, your beliefs. Here's another example of a belief that is commonly held, which you may discover that you also hold, but then you also want to challenge perhaps. And in this case, it says learning is more effective if students discover ideas for themselves. This is the idea of learning by discovery. If a student or a pupil discovers something for themselves in any subject, learning is going to be more effective. And again, this is a belief I come across quite a lot when I work with teachers. Here's a quote from a teacher I worked with once, and I noticed that in their lessons, they were doing a lot of discovery work. They never explained grammar to students, but they gave students exercises. And as a result of those exercises or tasks, the hope was that students would discover grammar themselves. And, afterwards we sat down, we talked about this with the teacher, and I asked her to comment on that. And these are her actual words. And she said, when I actually do something myself, I'm more likely to remember it more than if someone just gives it to me on a plate. So I feel that if you're actually having to do something, you have to work for it. You appreciate what you get at the end. So in essence, what this teacher is saying, that as a learner, she feels that if she works hard at something, it's more memorable. Therefore, she believes that the same applies to her learners. And so this is quite a common belief that I come across when I work with teachers. And of course, it's the idea of discovery learning is also widely discussed in pedagogical and methodological literature on teaching across subjects. So again, we might find, you might find yourself saying, I ascribe to this belief. Well, then the next step in becoming self-aware as a teacher is to say, well, what is the evidence for it, apart from my own personal opinion? And again, we'd go away and we'd look for evidence, and we might find something like this, which says that enthusiasm for discovery learning is not supported by research evidence. Although learners do need to build new understanding on what they already know, if teachers want them to learn new ideas, knowledge, or methods, they need to teach them directly. Now, we're not saying we should completely abandon our beliefs because we read something like this, but at least this should force us to think, force us to question our beliefs and any behaviors, any professional behaviors that are based on them. Because this states very clearly that enthusiasm for discovery learning is not supported by research evidence. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't do discovery learning, but it also means you shouldn't do it without thinking carefully about the effect it's having on learning. It suggests that as a teacher, you need to be monitoring the results or the consequences or the learning that comes out of discovery learning, that you need to be experimenting with other, perhaps more direct teaching strategies as well, to see what happens there. So this is a very useful part of becoming self-aware, because it just forces us to question things perhaps that we take for granted. It forces us to step back and to say, well, perhaps what I'm doing is not the only way to do things. Perhaps there are other ways of doing things. Perhaps there are better ways of doing things. And these are the kinds of questions that really should characterize us as professionals who are in a constant state of growth and development. So how do we become aware of beliefs in terms of evidence? Earlier we talked about how do we collect evidence of what we do. Now, in this case, how do we collect evidence of why we do things? And again, we can engage in reflective writing of some kind. That means just sitting down and writing a little bit about what you do and why you do it and what the reasons for it are. You can engage with critical friends. Critical friends are people you can talk to, people you trust. Maybe you'll invite them to your lessons. They're the kinds of people who ask you difficult, challenging questions about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and force you to think more deeply about these issues. Reflective groups are groups of teachers who meet together regularly just to talk about teaching. This is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. And what do you think about that? And what are you doing? And how are you doing it? And why are you doing it? That's a very useful process for professionals to engage in on a regular basis. There's also a sort of autobiographical work, which can be interesting here. And that means reflecting on our past to try to understand how our past as learners might be shaping our beliefs and practices today as teachers. So if you remember the quote I just mentioned to you, about discovery learning, that teacher said, discovery learning works for me, and therefore I believe it works for my learners. So the root of the teacher's belief there was her own experience as a learner. And so thinking about how our past might be influencing our present as professionals is also a useful way of becoming aware of our beliefs. And of course, there's plenty of evidence that the beliefs we have as teachers may be established much earlier in our life. I've done work with primary school children, for example, where I ask them about their views about teaching and learning. And even 7, 8-year-olds already have quite clear views about what good teaching is. So we don't just start developing beliefs about teaching when we become a teacher. Those beliefs may be established much earlier in life, and a useful part of becoming more aware as a teacher, more self-aware, is perhaps thinking about how our past may be shaping our present as teachers. That's another useful and interesting thing that we can be doing. Okay, so we had behavior, becoming aware of what we do. We had the rationale, becoming aware of why we do what we do. That includes thinking about the unobservable dimensions of teaching, beliefs, attitudes, but also thinking about the impact of context. And then the third element in the equation was the consequences, the results. What are the results of our behavior? What are the consequences of what we do? And when it comes to learning, an important question for us is the one you can see here. Are we effective? Are we effective as teachers, and effective in the sense of supporting learning? Are we giving our learners a positive learning experience? And this is the key question for us. How do we know that our teaching has a positive impact on student learning? Because ultimately that's our job. Our job is to facilitate student learning, to make the learning experience as positive and as worthwhile as possible for students. That's why we engage in professional development, to develop as teachers, but we want to develop as teachers so we can support learning more effectively. So although this is the third question in our equation, in many ways it's the most crucial one. So how can we find out about the consequences, the effect of our behaviors as teachers on what students learn? And we've already mentioned some of the things you can do. You can get feedback from learning. You can be, of course, looking at the kinds of work that students do, the quality of the work. You can be looking more objectively at achievement, records of achievement. But I just wanted to draw your attention to a collaborative way of going about this. And there's this text here, which you may be able to find online, or a summary of it online, called Protocols for Professional Learning. And this is a collaborative strategy for looking at effectiveness and looking at learning. And basically it involves teachers getting together collaboratively, looking at the work students are producing. So it might be teachers across a particular grade teaching a particular subject, meeting regularly to look at the kind of work students are producing in relation to the curriculum, and developing an understanding of how effective these teachers' practices are in helping students understand the curriculum and meet the objectives of the curriculum, and which aspects of the curriculum students need more help with. So I think that's a useful strategy, apart from getting feedback from students and looking at objective measures of achievement, is engaging in this collaborative analysis of the work students actually produce, and then looking at that, talking about that, and developing from that an understanding of how effective teaching is and how it can be made perhaps more effective. So understanding behavior, understanding what we do, understanding why we do it, and then finally thinking about the consequences of our behavior on learning. But of course, don't forget, there can be other kinds of consequences. Under teacher behavior earlier, we talked about relationships with colleagues. And of course, there are consequences there. So you might want to understand your behavior, I don't know, during staff meetings or when you work with colleagues, why you behave that way, and what the consequences of that behavior are for collegial relationships and collaborative work. The same principles apply. So you may, just to conclude, you may be familiar with the saying in English that ignorance is bliss. We can smile about that in the context of cartoons such as this, but the reality is that in the context of being a professional, ignorance is not bliss. Our goal needs to be as self-aware, and in this context, self-aware is the opposite of ignorance, to be as self-aware as possible, because it's that self-awareness of what we do, of why we do it, and of the consequences of what we do is going to bring us bliss, is going to bring us greater satisfaction, greater success as teachers. So I hope there are some ideas you can all take away and apply to your work, irrespective of the context you work in, the levels you work with, and the subjects you teach. And I think we've got a little bit of time now to take a few questions from you today. So thank you very much, and we'll have a look at the questions now.
Thank you so very much for this wonderful talk, Simon. I really appreciate it. And now the floor is open for questions and answers. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll be taking your questions. So yeah, Noreen has a question. What is the leadership role in developing self-awareness practices in institutions?
Yeah, okay, well, we can start with that one. So I'm just I'm just trying to find out where I'm just looking for the question. Could you read out the actual question? Oh, here, I found it. Yes. So what is the leadership role in developing self-awareness practices? And yeah, that's a really good question, because I think leadership plays an important role. Very often teachers will struggle or will find it too challenging just to start doing this work on their own, independently. And it's a lot easier to start exploring what you do, why you do it, and the results of what you do if you're doing it within a structure. And ideally, yeah, the structure might be set up within your institution. And for that to happen, there needs to be some leadership. So it might be someone who's coordinating professional development in an institution. It might be a senior teacher, a coordinator for a particular subject, who takes the lead in creating structures within which teachers can begin to explore these kinds of issues. And then I think once things are set up, and teachers become accustomed to what exploring self-awareness involves, then they're able to maybe in time pursue that more independently. But I do think that to start with, there's a lot of benefit in having a structure set up within which a group of teachers, perhaps with some mentoring, some leadership, can work through the process together. Okay, let's see what other questions we have.
Yes, thank you. Kelly says, thank you. I was just going to share the quote from Mahatma Gandhi: happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. That's a wonderful quote.
Yes, that is an excellent quote. And we not that I want to try and go beyond Gandhi, of course, but it's also when we are aware of all of those elements, and even when they are not in harmony, that we're aware of that, and that stimulates us to start thinking about why. Because the reality is in teaching that what we believe or what we think will not always be in harmony with what we do. That's just the reality of being a teacher. In other words, we don't work in a utopia. We work within a system, and the system will always constrain or shape, to use a more positive word, what we do. So there will be times where we want to do things in a particular way, but we simply can't because of the system we work in, and that's okay. It doesn't mean we're a bad professional if what we want to do and what we do are not the same. What's important is we are aware of that gap and we understand the reasons for it. And if we understand the reasons for it, we might be able to think about ways around it, or we might just be able to accept it without being too hard on ourselves. So a mismatch between what we believe or think and what we do is not necessarily something to criticize teachers for, because that's very often the nature of the work. What's important, though, is that we are aware when that is the case and why that is the case. Yeah. Okay, I'm just looking through the questions here.
Yes, another question on YouTube from Maria. She asked that which strategies you think should be followed for self-awareness being a teacher.
Could you repeat the first part of the question, please?
Yeah, she's asking about some strategies to be followed as professional self-awareness.
Okay, strategies for becoming self-aware as a teacher. Okay, I mentioned a few in the talk. It's if you're focusing on behavior, so self-awareness of behavior, we've got things like self-observation, peer observation are great. Anything that allows you to see, to stand back from what you do and to look at what you do more objectively. anything that allows you, in a sense, to look in the mirror, as long as the mirror is giving an accurate picture of what you do. And that's why, video recording is the best of all, although very often it's the most painful, of course, for us to watch. That's awareness of behavior, awareness of beliefs. The strategies there are to do with reflection, looking at what you do and asking yourself, or allowing others to ask you, to explain why you do what you do. So that kind of reflection, articulation, talking about teaching is a useful thing. And then awareness of the results of what we do. Of course, very often what we need to be doing is looking at
Great.
the
Another
work that
question
students. Yeah. It's awareness of consequences is looking at the
So
work.
another question, what do you think is the link between
Yeah, sorry, we have a little bit of a lag.
Yes, so another question. Yes, so another question was about what's the link between action research and self-awareness?
Yeah, action research is an excellent strategy for developing self-awareness. I think that the two work very well together. Action research is a systematic way of exploring what we do in the classroom. In other words, we're going to do something quite consciously. We're going to think about, of course, why we want to do that, and we're going to look quite closely at the results. The slight difference, of course, with action research is that we are purposely introducing something different. We're introducing an innovation into our teaching and then monitoring what happens. So the sequence might be, first we start looking at what we normally do and why we do it and the results of that. And then we become more aware maybe that there are some issues we can address. And then we can use action research to try out something different and to monitor the results of that. So I think, action research is a useful strategy which can work alongside and can support efforts for teachers to become self-aware, definitely. And I'd encourage you to read more about that professional development strategy.
Wonderful. And a question from Sadaf. She asked, how much self-grooming is important for a teacher compared to self-awareness?
How much what was it?
Self-grooming. You can look at the question in the chat.
Is it towards the bottom? Self-grooming.
252.
Yes, I'd need to interpret what they mean by self-grooming. I'm not entirely sure. Is that can we get some explanation of what self-grooming means in the context of this question? I mean, I understand the word grooming. It could be making ourselves look good in the eyes of others, but perhaps that's not what's meant. So maybe it's someone for us to return to later on.
Thank you so very.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so very much, Simon. Any final message of words for our audience?
No, just thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope there's something there you can all take away. I know you're working in very diverse contexts, but I think I chose this topic because I think it's one that's universally applicable to teachers anywhere and to teachers of any subject. So whatever we teach, wherever we teach, whoever we teach, we can always follow these principles of thinking about what we do, why we do it, and whether it's effective. And by doing that, we can become more self-aware and more effective professionals. So that's my final message to you all today.
Thank you so very much, Simon. I would love to have extended this Q&A session, but we are having a power breakdown here, and experience all these technical glitches and internet has slowed down. So, I would like to end it here. So thanks very much. I appreciate your presence, and I've been waiting so long for your talk, and it was very engaging and thought-provoking talk. Thanks very much for all these ideas, and that we quite often do not listen. So yeah. And for this recording will also be available at Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. If you want to share with your colleagues, I'll encourage you to do so. And for our future webinars, we're available on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. So keep following us on our social media channels. And if you want a certificate for this session, you can email on info.tdwebinars@gmail.com. You can also visit a newly established website, www.tdwebinars.org, for future events. So thanks very much to one and all, and take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.